Welcome, everybody, to another special event. The feedback we got last week was that you enjoyed the program, and we hope that you will enjoy the one again today. I was asked the question, how are we doing so far? And I think we're doing okay. And when you see come December, then January through the rest of the year, there are a couple of real surprises on that, which will keep you coming. That's important. If it's okay, I know there's more than one ambassador in the room today, between Ambassador Withers and between Ambassador Brenda Schoonover, and there may be another one I'm overlooking, but I did want to tell one little anecdote. Before Terry and I moved here, we have very good friends that also live in Falls Church, and they said, when you go to North Carolina, you'll finally get to meet the Schoonovers. And we're going, oh, great, this will be great. We'll finally get to meet them. And, it sticks in the back of your mind, but you don't think too much of it. Well, when we did meet, unfortunately, Brenda's husband had passed away. And we met at a restaurant called, I believe it was called Magnolia Grill. And we're sitting there, and Brenda's on my side, and she said, well, where did you grow up? And I said, in Southern California. She said, where did you go to school? And I said, Brenda, you would never have heard of it. It was a small college. She said, was it the University of California, Riverside? And I said, yes, it was. And then I said to her, without going a moment further, I said, and your husband was ahead of my dorm mother was her mother. When I started at UCR, there were 900 students. This woman that was graduated, there were 1,300. Was my dorm mother. Well, those days, most of the university of anything bad. Anyway, to make a long story short, at the end, then finally she tells me in February, she said, Dick, I didn't realize it, but husband both had the same birthday, February the 9th. Serendipitous, right? Most of you have met Brenda, know who she is. She's often referred to as the lady with the great hats. And that's how we might know her. So it's my pleasure. I'm not taking away your time, John, but now I'll introduce you to Brenda, and she'll take over and do the introduction for you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Did he say great hats or gray hair? Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and good afternoon again, everybody. There are a few books outside that our author has brought for us. They are available. If you happen not to have money or a check, you can do an IOU, and the interest rate is low. I'm honored to have the privilege of introducing Ambassador John L. Withers II. Am I doing something wrong here? Former ambassador to Albania, also a retired career Foreign Service officer, albeit a little bit more recently than my own retirement. I also want to welcome another senior Foreign Service officer, his wife, Mary Ruth Goldman. Just 3 days after Veterans Day, we pay special tribute to our veterans. It's most fitting that John is discussing his book, Balm in Gilead, a story of the war. It's about John's late father, a World War II veteran, Lieutenant John L. Withers. Thanks to a mutual friend, I had the pleasure of meeting Senior Withers with John's mother, Basie, several times in 1990. The 1990s. I had no idea that John Sr. had been in World War II. Before I turn it over to the guest speaker, I want to take the liberty of quoting from a portion of the book that I found a significant turning point of self-revelation, maturity, and courage. As the lieutenant weighed his decision about sheltering 2 Holocaust victims, which was against military rules, he reflects, All his life, outside forces, the structure of segregation, the church, the dictates of family, military orders had determined his course, made choices for him. What passed for choice was for him was figuring out what others expected and doing it. Right was acting as someone told him to act. Wrong was anything else. He beheld the correct decision. Was he brave enough now to do the right thing? Welcome, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, I would very much like to start off with a few words of thanks. I am actually from North Carolina. I was born down the road in High Point. My mother, grandmother, all of my aunts lived in High Point from time to time. My father was born and raised in Greensboro. Now, to say that isn't to say that I remained in Greensboro very long. They were Foreign Service people, and I was whisked all over the world. But in these last couple of days, my wife and I have toured around to the old spots, the old places where my parents lived and where I intermittently lived. And it's remarkable the degree to which that North Carolina element is still very, very much with me. I'm so delighted to be back. My second thanks is to all of you for being interested in sharing the story that I wish to tell. And I need to say thank you to three other very special people. The first is Ambassador Brenda Schoonover, who set all of this up. She will not tell you this, but I will tell you this. She's a legend within the State Department and within the Diplomatic Corps. I'd also like to thank someone you haven't met. Her name is Debbie Schwartz. And at a crucial moment during the story, she was able to assist me in finding what had become of one of the two young Jewish men I will talk about. And the third is Ms. Bernita Reed, who arranged oral history symposiums and knew in and out the history of this area and was of great assistance, an old friend going back to my early 20s, and without whom this story would not have come together. So I want to thank all of you. The story I'm about to tell takes place in the midst of vast and powerful historical events. World War II, the Jim Crow era in the South, the Holocaust. But it's really about three young men brought together in the most unlikely of circumstances, but who together try to maneuver their way through these enormous obstacles that they face. So I want you to go back with me to the spring of 1945. The war in Europe has just ended. And at that particular time, an order came to an all-black quartermaster truck company. It was an emergency order to take particular supplies to a German village with an unpronounceable name. It was an emergency. You must get on the road right away. My father, who was a lieutenant in this company, and the rest of the men were very dubious about all of this. These orders came all of the time. Every order they received was an immediate order. And the joke amongst the company was that every order was leave right away and arrive even sooner. More than that, with the war ending, the soldiers were focused on coming home. And their minds were full of their mother's cooking and seeing their old girlfriends again and hanging out with the guys and socializing as they had done before they had been called up. And so they were not paying much attention to this. So these orders were just too common, too rote. And so when they arrived at this German village, they were shocked because it turned out to be the Dachau concentration camp shortly after Dachau had been liberated. Now, these were men who had grown up in tough times. They were mostly from the Jim Crow South. They were dirt farmers and sharecroppers, and they had seen the tough side of life, but they had never seen anything like Dachau, even as the relief efforts tried to improve the situation. They were even more shocked a few days later when a couple of Dachau prisoners, still in their prison garb, appeared before the gate where the company was bivouacked. And even though they didn't have much English or anything, just through sheer sign language and desperation, they got across to these men that they needed help. They would do anything. They would wash the trucks, they would wash dishes, whatever it was, just to give them a little pittance, a little livelihood, so that they could make their way somehow in post-war Germany, which of course was in ruins at the time. So these men faced a decision, a real decision. The key element of that decision was that the U.S. Army, and remember, this was a wartime army, tough discipline, no nonsense. You break orders and you could go to the brig. You could, in the worst cases, you could be dishonorably discharged. But the U.S. Army did not allow displaced persons, as these young men would be called, to be housed amongst the American military. First of all, these people were infected with all kinds of diseases, and should a truck company become infected, moving around as they did, carrying supplies, they could infect a good portion of the army instantly. But secondly, there was the morale. The army didn't know how its troops, and remember most of the troops are 19, 20 years old, how its troops were going to respond to seeing people who had been so badly mistreated for so long. So strict orders, no. The thing to remember is that these guys would soon be going home. And they just simply could not afford a black mark on their record. My father, for example, had grown up in Greensboro. He had struggled to try to make his way in life. He had graduated from North Carolina A&T, but everywhere he turned, it seemed as though his way was blocked. He now knew of the GI Bill. And he knew of the GI Bill because of all people and all places, Eleanor Roosevelt had come to Greensboro and had spoken at Bennett College, which is literally right across the street from where he lived, saying to the student body there that when men came home, know of the GI Bill, know how it can help them reaccustom themselves to civilian life. And of course, the news of Eleanor Roosevelt visiting Greensboro, his sister and his mother and so on, sent all the clippings, so he knew about this. And he felt that his one last shot at making his way would be to use this bill, maybe to go back to school, get a doctorate, break out of the segregated life that he had previously lived. So when these two boys were brought before him, in the scene that Ambassador Schoonover just read, he faced a real dilemma. He was breaking orders, and he was jeopardizing his future. And remember, when they came back, it was segregation. They had no recourse through law. They had no recourse through economics. Socially, they were demeaned, on and on and on and on. And all of this substantiated and declared by major decisions of the Supreme Court of the United States. It was a risk. And yet, nevertheless, he and his men took the young men in. It was quite a decision, but they did it. And we can talk about why they might have done it in a bit. But sometimes I think it comes down to not what the hard decision is, but what the right decision is. In any event, these two men came in to the company, and the soldiers nourished them, fed them, got them medical assistance, and put them to work. And they just basically made them the new recruits of the company. And the kids took to this. The kids really, really took to this. This was something positive in their lives, and they really blended right in. And pretty soon, these two young men were essentially the little brothers of the company. There were adjustments that needed to be made. 150 black soldiers and these two young kids, both of them from Poland. So the first adjustment was the names. All right, the young men were Shlomo Yaskowitz and Mieczysław Eichenberg. Now, you guys are from the South, and so you know that tongues don't quite make it around there. And the soldiers complained, how can you have a name that long without any vowels in it? So they had to decide how to call them. Well, Shlomo was anglicized Solomon. So, okay, the older boy, 18, 19 years old, Solomon. The younger kid, Mieczysław Eichenberg, they just gave up. And they just decided they called him by that old familiar Southern nickname, Pee-wee. So Solomon and Pee-wee, the latest recruits to the U.S. Army in Germany. They had to teach the kids what to eat slowly. They had to show them how to do various things, but the kids loved work. It was almost as though it was therapeutic. On the other side, the kids had some adjusting to do too. First of all, they had to learn how to speak some English so that they could communicate with the soldiers. And it was remarkable how rapidly they did that. It was as though it was almost a survival quality, that where they had been before, they had to learn quickly how to communicate with those around them in whatever situation that they had been. And they did. They learned English with enormous rapidity. But there were two elements of this new tongue that they could now speak. The first one was that there was a distinct Southern accent when they began talking. And the second one was it was soldiers' English. And as you all know, soldiers' English can be kind of ripe. Well, kids didn't know. You know, as far as they were concerned, this implement that you used was a damn hammer. And other things were even worse. And when my dad learned of this, he had to kind of, straighten it out a bit. But over the course of time, they stayed with the company for right about a year. And when the company would pack up and move, as quartermasters did, move out on the road, no longer have these nice bivouacs, sleep in some kind of old castle or old shoe factory or something. The kids just went right along with them. And they would say, in this all-black truck company, they'd found a home. And it was home wherever that company moved, even if it was in the cabin of a 2.5-ton truck. It was home. At the end of the year, the company ended up in a beautiful little German village named Staffelstein, and there they were given a permanent assignment. They didn't move out of Staffelstein. And it was there that the kids really started coming into themselves. Instead of just staying with the company, they would begin to move out on their own. The company used them as translators to buy food from the local farmers. But eventually the kids they were confident, finally, again. And they started to move around. They would not talk about anything that had happened in their past. That was a forbidden subject. And if you tried to raise anything about their home or their family and so on, they would just burst into tears and they would just run away. So there was a lot that they were struggling with that was extremely traumatic. What they began to do, and this wasn't conscious or planned or anything, but what they began to do was, in the evening after the work was done, they would gravitate. This is gravitating. Let me see if that's going to work. Can you hear me? Okay, what they would do is they'd gravitate to my father's quarters. Now, my father was an officer. He was quite well educated. He had his master's degree at the time, and he was older, a bit more mature than these other young men. And they would come into his quarters and they would ask about these strange habits of the African American soldiers. So, for example, they could not understand why at night a great many of the African American soldiers would take a stocking, cut off one end, tie the other in a knot, pomade their hair, pull it down over their hair, and sleep with this contraption. They didn't understand that. What in the world was going on? And my dad would explain that this was a way of fashioning for these young men to felt that it was stylish and it made them look a lot better. But slowly these talks began to expand into many different other things. And my father would tell them stories. He would tell them about things that had happened in his childhood. They were fascinated when he discussed the great tornado that blew through. They had never encountered tornadoes. But in all of this, they would sing songs, they'd tell little jokes. It was just a nice little gathering. But my father began to realize that it was something more. That these kids, in a very disparate, uncoordinated way, were looking for something from him. Now, he's not a psychologist. He didn't really know. He didn't really understand. And they continually, but the one thing that sort of brought it together was they continually asked about one thing: America. Over and over and over again, America. What kind of land was this? What kind of place? If they were to go there, what could they do? Could they get jobs? Could they make a little money? Could they, America, America, America. That was a mythic America. It was the America that they had learned out of old magazines, or out of newsreels or something like that. It wasn't a real America. But my father began to realize that what they were really asking was, what does the future hold for us? And he suddenly realized that the responsibility that they were bringing to him, almost imposing on him, was to reassure them, to give them reasons to believe once more, to say to them, even though he did not know anything about what had happened to them, because they wouldn't speak of it, but to say to them, however horrid your past was, you're young, you're bright, the future still has hope. About a year into all of this, it became clear to one and all in the company, in the little beautiful village, that the company was about to be discharged. But by this time, the young men were confident, healthy, and so on, and they had begun already to become more and more independent of the company. Solomon, for example, met a young woman from Poland who had undergone the terrors in the war. They got engaged, and later on they got married. Pee-wee moved into the nearby city of Bamberg. And lo and behold, with the skills that he had learned from the soldiers and taking care of trucks and jeeps and so on, he got a job in a company that specialized in auto repair. The day finally came. My father was discharged, and they exchanged gifts, and he departed. Always wondering about these two young friends of his. Let's leap forward many decades. My father aged. He grew old. He retired. He became ill. And as he became ill, he changed. He was not the gregarious, confident, outgoing person that he had been. He was inward looking. And that was very uncharacteristic of my dad. So I turned to my mother and I said to her, "What's going on? What's with him?" And she said, "He is, because of his illness, he's conscious of his mortality. And he's trying to reassess this long life of his and to see what it adds up to." And I said, "Well, that's silly. He's a great guy, raised a wonderful family, friends, successful in the U.S. government, in the career of his choice. Let's just march in there and tell him." And she said, "You can't do that. He wouldn't comprehend that. You've got to show him." And I said, "Well, how am I going to show him?" And she said, "You're kind of a kook. You'll think of something." And eventually I did hit on something. All of my life, as my brother and I were growing up, my father was a great storyteller. And overseas, we were signed to places where there was no TV, no radio, no nothing. It was, electricity would go out constantly. Vientiane, Laos in 1958. It wasn't even a sewer system or a running water system back then. It was very much a country that was developing. And so on an evening when the monsoon rains began to fall, we would sit around and tell stories, and he would tell all of these different stories. Now, as kids, my brother and I wanted to hear his war stories. And eventually, he didn't like to talk about the war, but eventually he would tell us a few things. He'd tell us about a time when the convoy had been strafed. He would tell us about a time when it was caught between the German and the American lines. And we just loved that kind of a story. It convinced us that our father single-handedly had won the war. And no one could say different. But whenever he would tell the stories, whatever they were, humorous or adventurous or whatever, he would always end the evening with this one. And it was a story about, from our understanding, which wasn't much, there were these two kids, and they were this, and they ended up in the camp, and this, and eventually he had to leave them, and we couldn't understand why that meant so much to him. My mother would dig around, and she would find an old photo here, some guy dressed in an army uniform and stuff, and they would say, "Oh, that's a kid." We didn't know what was going on. But as time passed, the more we understood significance in the story, even if we couldn't quite define the significance, we understood. But more than that, we understood that this was extremely meaningful to my dad. Whatever it was, it held this deeper meaning. And so one thing led to another, and eventually I thought, well, let me try to see if I can, put this story together. Let me see if I can find some of the men in his old unit. Let me see if I can, maybe, we could put things together. And so I began a search. It took me years upon years, but I began it. And finally, initially I made a mistake. I started trying to find the soldiers. And that was very hard. There were privacy regs, and many of them had passed away, and they were all scattered all over the place. And my younger brother said, no, start with the boys. See if you can track them. So I started. And again, roadblocks, red herrings, dead ends, so on. Years passed. But finally, as I was looking through all of these places, I got a couple of little note cards from Yad Vashem, the great Holocaust museum in Israel. And I got a few other little things. And I began to get these little leads. The key thing was that I didn't have Solomon's full name. I couldn't trace him with Solomon, first name, last name, so on. So I had to trace Mieczysław Eichenschwer. And fortunately, he had sent a postcard. And on the back of the postcard was his full name, his nickname Pee-wee, and other data. And putting this all together, I began to trace his career and all of the horrors that had happened to him. I found his hometown. I found that he had been in Auschwitz. I found that he had been on the death march, the same death march that Elie Wiesel describes in his great book, Night. I found how he was sent to Buchenwald, and when Buchenwald was at last liberated, he was put on a train. The Nazis wouldn't just flee Buchenwald and let the poor people who were there fall into the hands of the Allies. No, they put him on a train, and they shipped them back and forth across what was left of the Reich. And many of them starved to death on board these trains. And then one day things started falling into place. I found out that there was a man, University of North Carolina, who was studying one of the camps that Pee-wee had been in. and that he had interviewed a lot of the survivors of that camp. So I called him up, and a very nice man, and he said no, he had not actually interviewed Mieczysław, but there was this incredible man up in Canada who was himself a survivor. He'd taken the name Howard Chandler, but he was himself a survivor, and he had all kinds of information about other survivors of the camp. So I called him. And one thing led to another, but finally he says, "Oh, you're looking for Mieczysław Eichenberg?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh," he said, "I know him. I was a childhood playmate of his. And I've got a phone number for him. He's living in Connecticut now." And you can imagine the psychology after all of those years of getting that news. So I sat down and I called the number. And in all of this searching and all of this, it was the first time that I actually despaired, because I got a recorded message saying that the phone number was no longer in service. And in my state, I just thought, I missed him. He's passed away. But my wife here said, "You can't quit. You cannot give up." And I called Chandler again, and he said, "She's absolutely right. You cannot quit. You cannot give up. Let me dig around. Let me dig around a little bit. All right? We're close." Right at that moment, I got another communication from Yad Vashem in Israel. And what it said was, "We don't know we know his mailing address. We don't have a phone number or anything, but this might be important to you. We know his Americanized name." He wasn't going to bring, if he went to America, he wasn't going to bring Mieczysław Eichenberg with him. His name is Martin Wigan, and he lives in Connecticut. And immediately, the moment I got that, I sat down at my computer and I began frantically typing a letter to Martin Wigan of Connecticut. And I was in the middle of typing it when the phone rang. Picked up the phone, Yes? A woman's voice came on the line. She said, "My name is Barbara Berggren. I'm looking for a Mr. Wickers." Wrong number, and I was very short with her. And she says, "Well, but I got a call from a Mr. Chandler who said you're looking for a relative of mine." Now I'm listening. She said, but immediately again, psychology. I thought, if she's calling, he can't. No, she says. "Look, I'm his daughter. I'm Martin Wigan's daughter. He has a hearing problem. And I just wanted to get your permission to stay on the line to help you communicate." And at that moment, a soft voice, slight Eastern European accent came on the line. And he said to me, "Did you say your name was John Withers?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you by any chance related to Lieutenant John L. Withers of Greensboro, North Carolina?" I said, "Yes, he's my father. I saw him this morning. He's doing well." And this man said, "You tell him I'm doing well too." I was shaking. I was really shaking. I couldn't really tell you feeling, thinking, and all that, but I did have enough sense to get down every bit of contact information that he had. His daughter had, his son had. If he'd had a pet poodle, I would have gotten the contact information. And what had happened with the phone call was this. I'd studied in Connecticut. And when I was there for 8 years or so, the state had one area code. Right? Just to make my life complicated, after I left, they divided the state and they had 2 area codes. So the phone number was correct and the area code was wrong, and that's how I couldn't reach him. 3 weeks later, well, what I did immediately then was to call my parents and to say, look, Mom, get off the phone, all right? Don't talk to your sister tonight, all right? No Army buddies, nothing. You leave that line blank. And that night, Pee Wee called him. 3 weeks later, we were in Hartford, Connecticut for one of the most emotional weekends that I've ever had. And these two men were reunited 55 years to the day after Dachau was liberated. When they were together again, something changed in Pee Wee. And what changed was that all of this time, even with his own family, even with his own kids, he refused to talk about his past. His kids were desperate to learn. But he wouldn't say a word. And this is a common trait of people who've been through vast traumas, including Holocaust survivors. But when my dad was there, he started to open up. He started to open up. I'm going to... the other thing that he did was he gave me Solomon's full name. And Solomon had gone to Israel. As far as Pee Wee knew, he was still there. And so I thought, oh my God, I can't go through another one of these long searches. But fortunately, I had a friend working in the Foreign Service at the embassy in Tel Aviv, Debbie Schwartz, who I mentioned earlier. I just called her. Do you have any friends at all in the Jewish agency? And she said, yes, I do. I know the head of the Jewish agency. And so a few days later, she came back with the information on Solomon. He unfortunately had passed away before I reached him. But his wife was there and his daughters. And when I spoke to his wife, she told me, she said, Solomon never forgot the colored man with the golden heart who taught him once more the good side of life and of human beings. And for his entire life, he carried a tiny photo in his wallet. And she sent me a copy of that photo. And it was my dad. And on the back it said, to my good friend Solomon, signed John Elwood. Let me stop here, but just say a couple of quick concluding things. Why? Why in the world did these men, these black soldiers, do what they did? Why did they take these risks? And I've researched this for over 20 years, and I can't give you a real answer. All right? I cannot give you a real answer. But what I would say is this: the more that I study it, the more that I believe that it comes out of the great tradition of African Americans, of that powerful moral sense that has been a part of my people since I can remember. The morality that is expressed in the spirituals of the slaves, and in the belief pumped into my father that you do not return hatred with hatred or anger with anger. You need to be better than that. But it comes down to me to a single question. What is the measure of a human being? Is it wealth? Is it fame? Is it power? Or is it something simpler, quieter, humbler that comes from inside of us? Solomon, Pee Wee, and Lieutenant John were as different as it was possible to be. Creed, culture, race, experience. But they shared one thing in common, and that was the ability to look another human being in the face and to see in that human being's eyes the humanity within, and to summon, therefore, their own humanity to respond in ways that are compassionate and understanding and kindly. I take comfort in the knowledge that three people like Solomon, Pee Wee, and Lieutenant John were once here. And I take encouragement from the fact that people like them still walk among us. Thank you so much for listening.
Any questions? Please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. They're all going to get A's.
When I was in Albania, the ambassador in Albania, we'd always reach the question period amongst students and so on. And it was amazing when someone said, or when I would say to them, does anyone have any questions? That these students would suddenly get extraordinarily interested in the carpet pattern. So in the roof. But once you got the first question, then it got a little, a little better. So if anyone does have any questions, please don't feel shy. Yes.
Were there any repercussions from your father and his organization there by taking in these two? You said that there could have been.
There could have been. Actually, no. And for really a pretty simple reason, and that was that no one knew. All right? They really kept these kids hidden. There was an inspection by the military shortly after the kids came into the company, and of course the soldiers were quite worried. Had they been discovered, there would have been real problems, and these inspectors, were very, very, very diligent in this. But what struck the soldiers was, first of all, once the kids found out what the U.S. military inspection was like, they were contemptuous. As far as they were concerned, that wasn't a real inspection. They'd had real inspections. But the second was that they, when the inspectors arrived, they vanished. Just vanished, as though into thin air. And after the inspectors are gone, the soldiers looked everywhere for these two young men. Never found them. And then later on, right around dinner time, right around chow time, boom, there they were. On another occasion, there was this tension between the military police and the truckers. The military police were constantly pulling the convoys off to the side of the road and checking their papers and doing this, that, and the other. But what it really was that, of course, truckers, the supply units, had access to supplies. And the going thing amongst truckers was that one crate out of every carton of goods that they supplied stayed with the company. So they always had coffee, they always had silk stockings, they always had chocolate, they always had all of these different things for themselves. And of course the police, these military police, were very, very strict until, a bottle of Jack Daniels happened, then suddenly, you guys are fine, go ahead. On this one occasion, the truckers were very vulnerable because the way that it worked was that the truckers would go back to these big supply depots, load up, carry the load out to the front, empty it, then swing back. And when they swung back, of course, the trucks were empty. Now, they had all these crates, Pee Wee and Solomon could hide behind the crates, but this time it was empty. And as the police began to search the cargo bays of the trucks, there was, Pee Wee's in the cabin, completely exposed. Well, one of the soldiers, a very clever man, slipped back into the back, and he took a tarp, and he threw it over Pee Wee, and then he sat on it. And he was there, sitting there, whittling or chewing on a toothpick or something when the MPs came in, and they took a look, and here's this guy. Closed it, and they went on. Right, when we met Pee Wee in 2001, he still remembered that incident, and he still remembered how indignant he was that trucker had put on some weight and was heavy. So, is there anyone else? Brenda.
Earlier when we were talking today, you talked about Holocaust Museum in Greensboro.
Yes.
Is it a museum or a park?
It is. What is going to happen, hopefully this summer, is a monument to Holocaust victims is going to be erected in the LeBauer Park in Greensboro. And the sculptor is an incredible lady named Victoria Milstein. She's already done the clay figure, and she will erect it there. It's not 100% done or anything because of fundraising, all that kind of thing. But what she wants is for this monument not just simply to be a statue that people look at and wander away. She wants first for there to be a camera, and people look through the camera at the statue, and then when they click the button, the words come up, "You are a witness." And then secondly, she's going to have a kind of an audio station, and she's looking to try to include stories of North Carolinians who had experiences with the Holocaust. And I don't hope I'm not getting ahead of the game, but she's asked if there was some way or another we could incorporate my father's story into that. And if so, it would be a really, really great honor. Yes?
Can you say a bit about the photographs on the program?
Sure. I need a program. Thank you. Okay. The top right photo, the one in color, I need to say a word about that. Despite the uncanny resemblance, that is not Denzel Washington. Okay? Now the other two. The photo of the soldier on the right is my father. And this was taken in 1946, quite possibly in this beautiful village of Staffelstein that I was telling you about. The other picture is of the two boys. Solomon is on the right, Pee Wee is on the left, and a soldier who was a friend of theirs. I don't know the soldier's full name. Pee Wee only remembered that it was Dave, so I couldn't trace him. But he was, this was when they were actually in the unit. If you look, let me see if I can pull together One more photo. Okay, here's one. I don't know if you can see it from there, but this photo is a picture of Solomon right about the time that he joined the unit. Okay, you can see how thin he is. All right, you can see that he's still wearing his Dachau jacket. However, he is wearing a pair of military pants and I think boots that the soldier gave him. So this was right at that time. All right, if you compare what this Solomon looks like with what this Solomon looks like, you can see that they were already coming around, that they were already becoming healthy again. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for bringing this story to us. I was just wondering, when it came to return to the States, any stories there? I mean, how did they get back? Or
Your Solomon and Pee-wee?
yes, or did they go with the troops, or did they stay in Europe? Excuse me, did they stay in Europe?
Very good question. Their histories, once they started talking them through, were quite remarkable, and I'll summarize them very, very quickly. Pee-wee was... This microphone's doing a convoy of its own. But they had been to virtually every awful concentration camp that you can imagine. When they finally got to the soldiers and so on, and they began to seek out the new phase of their lives. Solomon, I think I mentioned, met a young woman, also a Holocaust survivor. And they got engaged, and in time, they got married. Now, Solomon was from a large family from a city called Sosnowiec in Poland. And he had watched his whole family just being scattered and destroyed when the Nazis came in. Just before he lost his mother, she said to him and his younger sister that she'd had a premonition and that only the two of them would survive. One day, there are variations of this story, but the best I can make of it is that one day Solomon was walking through the train station in the nearby town of Bamberg. It was near this little village of Staffelstein. And he was walking through, and who should he literally run into but his sister Hanka? And she had survived. She was married, she had a husband, and she and her husband had decided to make it to Palestine, which was what Israel was known as then. And Solomon and his wife decided that they would go with them. So they crossed the Alps on foot to the Italian port of Bari. And there they got aboard a leaky ship, echoes of Exodus in this. They had tried to run the British blockade into Palestine, but they were caught, turned around, and put in yet another camp on Cyprus. But eventually made it to Israel just as the Arab-Israeli war, was breaking out. Solomon's wife was about to deliver their first child and had to be evacuated to the hospital as bullets raced around. He stayed there for the rest of his life. He had a second daughter, Initially, the Israeli economy was just a mess. It was very, very hard to make a living. He was out on a kibbutz, and it didn't go that well. But eventually, he and a partner developed a firm that supplied fresh fruits and vegetables to the residents of, and particularly the great hotels of Tel Aviv. And as more and more tourism became part of the tourist economy, he did quite well. He caught cancer. His first wife died, but he met a wonderful, wonderful lady, originally from Argentina. They married, had many, many wonderful years together before he came down with cancer, and he passed away in 1993. Pee-wee had determined that he too would go to Israel. And in point of fact, there were Israeli agents there who were trying to encourage Jews to go to this new state. He was actually there at the meeting point and decided that he couldn't, that he had met this young woman in Bamberg, and he just couldn't leave her. So he left the line to go back to her. Now, what was remarkable about this was that this woman was German, Catholic, and I guess some in her family had some, not close, but tentative Nazi associations. But that was Pee-wee. He didn't care. He didn't care what all of your, coordinates on a graph were. He cared very much about you. And he said, this was the woman that I loved, and that was that. And they remained married for the rest of their lives. Very close. The two of them did decide to go to Israel. They had a very difficult time there, as you can imagine. Margareta was not particularly welcomed in the atmosphere after the war. Very poor. They ended up sleeping for a while in a desanctified mosque. And at that point decided that they couldn't persist, and so they came back to Germany. And he got a job for a while with an army unit, a white unit this time. But when I met him, what he said to me was, I needed to get to America. Your father had told me about America. The reason I'm here in America is because of your father. And so they managed to scrape together a little money. They arrived in New York with almost nothing in their pockets. But again, Pee-wee was enormously skilled with all of these technical things, and he got a job in Groton, Connecticut, with it's a firm. I think it deals with submarines and stuff like that. And he did exceptionally well. However, his wife, who was a nurse, was going around to various types of assisted living homes. And as Pee-wee looked at these particular homes, he felt that these particular ones were not being run right. And so he borrowed a little money and he set up his own, and pretty soon he had 3. He was extremely prosperous. He bought houses for his kids. He had a beautiful villa down on Long Island Sound, and there he lived out the rest of his life. He died a couple of years after my dad met him. We went to the funeral, and eventually, in the midst of it, people were coming up and giving testimonials about him. And it was interesting that the audience there was like a mini United Nations. There were Jamaicans and there were Cambodians and there were, you name it, every ethnic group and religion and so on. Everyone came to talk about this incredible man. And eventually my father, who was probably at that time, he was well into his 80s, stood up and he came up to the speaker's stand and he looked around this group and he said, I've known Martin Wigan longer than anybody in this room. Let me tell you what kind of man he was. One last, or have you had enough? Well, thank you all very, very much.
Mr. Ambassador, I just want to add to that. Thanks. This was really incredible.
Oh,